The screaming started at exactly 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon that would forever change Maple Grove Lane. Sarah's voice, high and desperate, cut through the suburban silence like a blade. "Stop. Please stop." But the silver BMW continued its relentless forward crawl. The service dog's leash trapped beneath the front tire, dragging 10-year-old Sarah's lifeline across the hot asphalt. Neighbors poured from their homes, drawn by the commotion. Mrs. Chen dropped her watering can, sending a cascade of water across her prize-winning roses. Tom Bradley, still in his work clothes, sprinted across 3 lawns, his phone already dialing 911. The scene unfolded like a nightmare in slow motion, each second stretching into eternity as a small golden retriever named Buddy struggled against the merciless pull of rubber and metal. Behind the wheel sat Patricia Holloway, 62 years old, self-appointed guardian of the Maple Grove Homeowners Association's rules and regulations. Her manicured fingers gripped the steering wheel with the same iron determination that had made her the most feared figure in the neighborhood. Her silver hair was pulled back in its usual severe bun, and her thin lips were pressed into a line of righteous indignation. "Dogs are not permitted in common areas without proper documentation," she called out through her partially lowered window, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had never been challenged. This is clearly stated in Section 12 of the HOA guidelines. Sarah's father, Michael Torres, had been working in his home office when the screaming began, an attorney specializing in animal rights law. He was in the middle of reviewing a complex case involving therapy animal certification when the sounds of chaos erupted outside. He rushed to the window, and what he saw made his blood run cold. His daughter, the little girl who had struggled with severe anxiety since her mother's death 2 years ago, was being dragged along the street by her service dog's leash. Buddy, the golden retriever who had been specially trained to detect Sarah's panic attacks and provide deep pressure therapy, was yelping in pain as Patricia's BMW continued its inexorable advance. 3 weeks earlier, Sarah had been having one of her good days. The autumn air was crisp, and she had convinced herself that maybe, just maybe, she could walk to the mailbox without Buddy's help. But halfway there, the familiar tightness in her chest began to build. Her breathing became shallow, her hands started to shake, and the world around her seemed to tilt on its axis. That's when Buddy had sprung into action. The 18-month-old golden retriever had been trained by the best service dog organization in the state. He pressed his warm body against Sarah's legs, providing the deep pressure that helped regulate her nervous system. His presence was like an anchor in the storm of her anxiety, grounding her when her mind threatened to spiral into panic. Patricia had been watching from her living room window, her lips pursed in disapproval. In her 30-year tenure as the unofficial enforcer of Maple Grove's rules, she had seen countless violations: unleashed dogs, unauthorized garden gnomes, mailboxes painted in non-approved colors. But this was different. This was a direct challenge to her authority. She had studied the HOA guidelines with the dedication of a scholar. Section 12 clearly stated that pets must be registered with the association and that emotional support animals were not considered legitimate service animals. In her mind, there was no distinction between a legitimate service dog and what she considered to be a pampered pet used as a crutch for modern parenting. The first confrontation had happened the following Tuesday. Patricia had cornered Michael in the driveway as he was loading groceries into his car. "Mr. Torres, I need to speak with you about your dog situation." Michael had paused, a bag of groceries balanced in his arms. "I'm sorry. What situation?" "Your daughter has been walking an unregistered animal in the common areas. This is a clear violation of Section 12. I'm going to need to see documentation proving this is a legitimate service animal." Michael's jaw had tightened. As an attorney, he was well versed in the Americans with Disabilities Act and the rights of service dog handlers. Mrs. Holloway, with all due respect, you have no legal right to demand documentation for a service animal. Under federal law, you may only ask two questions. Is this a service animal? And what task is it trained to perform? Patricia's eyes had narrowed. This is a private community. Mr. Torres, federal law doesn't supersede our HOA covenants. That conversation had ended with Michael calmly explaining that federal law absolutely superseded HOA rules when it came to disability accommodations. But Patricia had walked away with her chin held high, clearly unconvinced and certainly not deterred. The second incident had escalated things considerably. Sarah had been in the community garden, working on a small plot that her father had rented to help with her therapy. Gardening was one of the few activities that seemed to calm her anxiety, and Buddy lay peacefully in the shade nearby, ever watchful for signs of distress. Patricia had approached with her clipboard and measuring tape, weapons of bureaucratic warfare. "This plot is 3 inches over the regulation size," she announced, her voice carrying across the garden. "And that animal is disturbing the other gardeners." Sarah had looked up from her tomato plants, her hands dirty and her face flushed with the exertion of honest work. "Buddy isn't bothering anyone. He's just lying there." "I've received complaints about dog hair in the vegetables," Patricia continued, though no such complaints had been filed. "This is a health hazard. The dog needs to be removed immediately." It was then that Mrs. Chen, the elderly woman who tended the plot next to Sarah's, had spoken up. "I've been gardening here for 15 years, and I've never seen a better behaved dog. That child needs her companion." Patricia's face had flushed red. "Mrs. Chen, I'm sorry, but rules are rules. If we make exceptions for one person, where does it end?" The confrontation had ended with Patricia threatening to have the garden plot reassigned, and Sarah dissolving into tears. It was Buddy who had sensed the approaching panic attack, pressing his body against Sarah's legs and providing the deep pressure that helped her regulate her breathing. Michael had received the call at his office. When he arrived at the garden, he found his daughter clinging to Buddy's fur, her face streaked with tears. The sight of his child in distress had awakened something fierce and protective in him, something that went beyond his professional interest in animal rights law. That evening, he had made several phone calls. First to the service dog organization that had trained Buddy, requesting additional documentation. Then to his colleagues in the disability rights community, asking about precedents for HOA conflicts. Finally, to the State Attorney General's office, inquiring about enforcement of the Americans with Disabilities Act in private communities. But Patricia had been busy too. She had called an emergency meeting of the HOA board, presenting what she claimed was a petition from concerned residents about the dog problem in the community. The petition, it would later be discovered, contained forged signatures and complaints from residents who had never been consulted. The board meeting had been scheduled for the following Thursday evening. Patricia had prepared extensively, printing out copies of the HOA covenants and highlighting what she believed were relevant sections. She had also prepared a PowerPoint presentation titled "Maintaining Community Standards, the Pet Problem." Michael had received the meeting notice with 24 hours advance warning, a clear violation of the HOA's own bylaws requiring a week's notice for non-emergency meetings. But he had prepared as well, gathering legal documentation and consulting with experts in disability law. The meeting had been a disaster. Patricia had presented her case with the fervor of a prosecutor, arguing that allowing unauthorized animals in common areas would lead to a breakdown of community standards. She had claimed that property values would plummet, that insurance rates would increase, and that the community would become a haven for every Tom, Dick, and Harry with a therapy peacock. Michael had responded with calm legal arguments about federal law and reasonable accommodations. But the board, clearly intimidated by Patricia's preparation and forceful presentation, had voted to uphold the pet restrictions pending further review. The compromise had been temporary and fragile. Sarah could continue to use Buddy in common areas, but only with constant supervision and only during designated hours. The restrictions were humiliating and impractical. But Michael had agreed to them temporarily, while he prepared for what he now realized would be a longer legal battle. The fatal Tuesday had started like any other day. Sarah had been having a particularly difficult morning, struggling with anxiety about an upcoming school presentation. Buddy had been providing constant companionship, his presence helping to keep her panic at bay. Around 3:30 p.m., Sarah had decided to take Buddy for a walk in the small park area that formed the heart of the Maple Grove community. It was well within the designated hours, and Michael was working from home, available if needed. The walk had been therapeutic. Sarah had been practicing her presentation out loud, using Buddy as her audience. The golden retriever had listened attentively, his tail wagging encouragingly. For a few precious minutes, Sarah had felt normal, like any other 10-year-old girl playing with her dog. That's when Patricia had appeared. She had been making her afternoon rounds, clipboard in hand, when she spotted Sarah and Buddy near the community fountain. Even from a distance, she could see that the girl was not accompanied by an adult, a clear violation of the recent board ruling. Patricia had approached with purpose, her heels clicking on the concrete walkway. "Young lady, where is your adult supervision?" Sarah had looked up, her face immediately flushing with anxiety. "My dad is at home. He said I could walk Buddy here." The board specifically stated that adult supervision was required at all times. This is a direct violation of the new rules. Buddy had sensed Sarah's rising stress levels and had moved closer to her. His body pressed against her legs. The dog's training had kicked in automatically. His entire being focused on providing comfort and stability to his handler. "I need to call my dad," Sarah had said, her voice small and frightened. "No, young lady. You need to remove this animal from the common area immediately. Take it home right now." Sarah had started to panic. Her breathing became shallow. Her hands began to shake, and the familiar tightness in her chest began to build. This was exactly the kind of situation that triggered her anxiety attacks, and Buddy had been trained to recognize the signs. The golden retriever had increased his pressure against Sarah's legs, his warm body providing the deep pressure therapy that helped regulate her nervous system. But Patricia had seen this as defiance, as a stubborn child using her pet to avoid following rules. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," Patricia had said, her voice rising. "This animal is not providing any legitimate service. It's simply encouraging dependency and defiance." Sarah had tried to explain through her rising panic. "Buddy helps me when I get scared. He's trained to help me breathe." "Nonsense. What you need is discipline, not a crutch. Now remove this animal immediately, or I'll have it removed for you." That's when Sarah had made the mistake of trying to leave. She had turned to walk away, Buddy at her side, the leash held loosely in her trembling hand. But Patricia had interpreted this as continued defiance, as a direct challenge to her authority. Patricia had returned to her car, a silver BMW that she drove with the same aggressive precision that characterized everything else in her life. She had driven to the entrance of the park area, positioning her vehicle to block Sarah's path home. "You will not leave this area until that animal is properly contained. She had called out through her window. "I'm calling animal control right now." Sarah had been in full panic mode now, her breath coming in short gasps, her vision starting to tunnel. Buddy had been working desperately to provide comfort, pressing his full weight against her legs, his presence the only thing preventing a complete meltdown. In her panic, Sarah had dropped the leash. Buddy, trained to stay close to his handler, had remained pressed against her legs, but the leash had fallen across the path, directly in front of Patricia's BMW. What happened next would be debated in courtrooms and discussed in news programs for months to come. Patricia would claim that she had simply been trying to position her car to prevent Sarah from leaving with an unauthorized animal. Sarah would testify that Patricia had deliberately driven forward, knowing that the leash was beneath her tire. The truth, as captured by a security camera that no one knew existed, was somewhere in between. Patricia had been focused on asserting her authority, on proving that her rules would be followed. She had seen the leash fall, but had made a split-second decision to continue forward, believing that the dog would simply move out of the way. But Buddy had been trained to stay with his handler, no matter what. Even as the BMW began to move forward, even as the leash grew taut, the golden retriever had remained at Sarah's side, his body pressed against her legs, his training overriding his self-preservation instincts. The screaming had started then. Sarah's voice, high and desperate, calling for help. Patricia's voice, sharp and defensive, claiming that she had done nothing wrong. And underneath it all, Buddy's yelps of pain as he was dragged across the rough asphalt. Tom Bradley had reached them first, his work boots pounding on the pavement as he sprinted across the community common. "Stop the car! You're hurting the dog!" But Patricia had not stopped, whether from shock, stubbornness, or something darker. She had continued to inch forward, the leash still trapped beneath her tire, Buddy still being dragged along the ground. It was Mrs. Chen who had finally broken the spell. The elderly woman had positioned herself directly in front of the BMW, her small frame dwarfed by the vehicle, but her presence commanding. "Patricia Holloway, you stop this car right now, or I'll lie down in front of it myself." The absurdity of the situation had finally penetrated Patricia's consciousness. She had stopped the car, but the damage was done. Buddy lay on the asphalt, his golden fur matted with blood and dirt, his right rear leg bent at an unnatural angle. Sarah had thrown herself down beside her companion, her hands hovering over his injuries, afraid to touch but unable to stay away. "Buddy, please be okay. Please don't leave me." Michael had arrived just as the first police car pulled up. He had seen the scene in fragments, his daughter cradling her injured dog, Patricia sitting in her car with the engine still running, neighbors standing in shocked clusters, their faces pale with disbelief. The paramedics had arrived first, followed closely by animal control and a veterinary emergency unit. Buddy had been loaded onto a stretcher, his tail wagging weakly as he was carried to the ambulance. Even in his pain, the golden retriever had been more concerned about Sarah than himself. The police officer, a young woman named Rodriguez, had taken statements from everyone present. Patricia had been adamant that the incident was an accident, that she had simply been trying to enforce HOA rules. But the witnesses painted a different picture, describing a deliberate act of aggression against a child and her service animal. Michael had followed the ambulance to the emergency veterinary clinic, Sarah crying silently in the passenger seat. At the clinic, Dr. Martinez had delivered news that was both devastating and hopeful. Buddy would live, but his injuries were severe. A broken leg, road rash covering much of his body, and trauma that would require months of rehabilitation. The physical injuries will heal, Dr. Martinez had explained. But with service dogs, psychological trauma can be just as serious. We'll need to work with his trainers to help him regain confidence. That night, Michael had made a decision that would change everything. He had called his law partner, Rebecca Chen, and asked her to clear his schedule for the next month. Then, he had called the State Attorney General's office, the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, and the National Service Dog Registry. The case that would become known as Torres v. Holloway and the Maple Grove Homeowners Association had been born in that moment, in a father's rage and a lawyer's determination to ensure that what happened to his daughter would never happen to another child. The media attention had started small, with a brief mention in the local newspaper's police blotter. But within days, the story had exploded across social media. A video taken by one of the neighbors had gone viral, showing Patricia's BMW dragging Buddy across the asphalt while Sarah screamed for help. The footage was grainy and shot from a distance, but the audio was crystal clear. Patricia's voice, sharp and unrepentant, claiming that she was enforcing community standards. Sarah's voice, breaking with panic and fear, begging for someone to help her dog. Animal rights activists had seized on the story, organizing protests outside the Maple Grove community gates. Signs reading "Justice for Buddy" and "Service Dogs Save Lives" had appeared overnight. The local news stations had sent reporters, and soon the story had been picked up by national outlets. Patricia had initially been defiant, giving interviews to anyone who would listen. She had portrayed herself as a victim of media sensationalism, a dedicated community volunteer who was being persecuted for trying to maintain standards. "I've devoted 30 years of my life to this community," she had told Channel 7 News. "I've never seen such an overreaction to a simple accident. This is exactly the kind of hysteria that occurs when people don't follow proper procedures." But the tide of public opinion had turned decisively against her. The video evidence was damning, and the sight of a small child crying over her injured service dog had touched something deep in the collective consciousness. Michael had filed the federal lawsuit on a Thursday morning, exactly 1 week after the incident. The complaint was comprehensive, citing violations of the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Fair Housing Act, and state laws regarding animal cruelty. He had also filed a separate civil suit seeking damages for Buddy's medical expenses, Sarah's emotional trauma, and punitive damages. The legal documents painted a picture of systematic harassment and discrimination. Michael had documented every interaction between Patricia and his family, every violation of federal law, every attempt to circumvent disability accommodations. The response from the HOA had been swift and decisive. At an emergency board meeting, Patricia had been removed from all positions of authority and banned from serving on future boards. The association had also voted to pay for Buddy's medical expenses and to issue a formal apology to the Torres family. But for Michael, that wasn't enough. The damage had been done, and he was determined to ensure that Patricia faced the full consequences of her actions. He had also filed complaints with the State Attorney General's office and the FBI's Civil Rights Division, arguing that the incident constituted a hate crime based on disability status. The criminal charges had been filed 3 days later. Patricia had been arrested at her home, charged with animal cruelty, reckless endangerment, and violating the civil rights of a disabled person. The arrest had been covered live on local television, with reporters following the police cars as they led Patricia away in handcuffs. The community had been divided. Some residents had supported Patricia, viewing her as a victim of political correctness run amok. Others had been horrified by what they saw as a deliberate act of cruelty against a child and her service animal. The protests had intensified. Animal rights activists had been joined by disability rights advocates, veterans with service dogs, and families affected by anxiety disorders. The demonstrations had grown from a handful of people to hundreds, with protesters lining the streets of Maple Grove and demanding justice. Sarah had been struggling with the aftermath of the incident. Her anxiety had worsened significantly, and she had developed a fear of cars and loud noises. The family had been forced to hire private security after receiving threatening phone calls and angry emails from Patricia's supporters. Buddy's recovery had been slow and painful. The golden retriever had undergone multiple surgeries to repair his broken leg, and his psychological trauma had been severe. The dog, who had once been confident and outgoing, had become fearful and withdrawn, flinching at sudden movements and showing signs of post-traumatic stress. The service dog organization had assigned their best trainers to work with Buddy, but the prognosis was uncertain. Some service dogs never fully recovered from traumatic incidents, losing their ability to work effectively with their handlers. Dr. Sarah Williams, a veterinary behaviorist brought in to evaluate Buddy, had explained the situation to the Torres family. Service dogs are trained to be fearless and confident, but they're still animals with emotions and memories. This kind of trauma can shake their fundamental trust in humans. The revelation that would change everything had come during the discovery phase of the lawsuit. Michael's legal team had subpoenaed Patricia's financial records, HOA correspondence, and personal communications. What they found had been shocking. Patricia had been embezzling money from the HOA for over 5 years. She had used her position as treasurer to funnel association funds into personal accounts, covering her tracks with fraudulent invoices and fake contracts. The total amount stolen was over $200,000 money that was supposed to have been used for community improvements and maintenance. The financial crimes had been carefully concealed, hidden behind layers of false documentation and creative accounting. Patricia had used the money to fund her lifestyle, paying for expensive vacations, luxury cars, and home improvements that she couldn't have afforded on her fixed income. The discovery had prompted a full audit of the HOA's finances, revealing the extent of Patricia's theft. She had also been using community funds to pay for her legal defense, adding fraud and misappropriation to her growing list of criminal charges. Michael had immediately filed additional motions, seeking to freeze Patricia's assets and recover the stolen funds. The case had evolved from a disability rights lawsuit into a major financial crimes investigation, with federal prosecutors taking interest in the broader implications. The trial had been set for early spring, but the media circus had already begun. News vans had become a permanent fixture outside the courthouse, and protesters had organized regular demonstrations demanding justice for Buddy and accountability for Patricia's crimes. Sarah had been working with a child psychologist to prepare for her testimony. Dr. Amanda Foster had been gentle but direct in explaining what the trial would involve, and how Sarah could help people understand what had happened to her and Buddy. "You're very brave for wanting to testify," Dr. Foster had told Sarah during one of their sessions. "Your story will help other children and their service dogs. You're making sure this never happens to anyone else." The day of the trial had dawned gray and cold, with protesters already gathering outside the courthouse by dawn. Sarah had been nervous but determined, holding Buddy's leash with one hand and her father's hand with the other as they walked up the courthouse steps. Buddy had been doing better, his physical injuries mostly healed and his confidence slowly returning. The golden retriever had been cleared to return to work, though he would need ongoing support to maintain his skills. His presence at the trial was both therapeutic for Sarah and symbolically powerful for the case. The prosecution had opened with a devastating presentation of the evidence. The security camera footage had been enhanced and analyzed, showing clearly that Patricia had seen the leash under her tire and had chosen to continue driving. Expert witnesses had testified about the deliberate nature of her actions and the severity of the trauma inflicted on both Sarah and Buddy. Dr. Martinez had testified about Buddy's injuries, describing in clinical detail the damage caused by being dragged across rough asphalt. The veterinarian had shown photographs of the dog's injuries, images that had caused several jurors to gasp audibly. Sarah's testimony had been the emotional centerpiece of the trial. The young girl had spoken clearly and bravely about her anxiety disorder, about how Buddy helped her manage her panic attacks, and about the terror she had felt watching her companion being hurt. "Buddy is more than just my dog," Sarah had said, her voice steady despite her tears. "He's my best friend. He helps me when I'm scared. When Mrs. Holloway hurt him, it felt like she was trying to hurt me too." The defense had tried to portray Patricia as a well-meaning community volunteer who had made a mistake under pressure. They had argued that the incident was an accident, that Patricia had been trying to enforce legitimate HOA rules, and that the media attention had blown the situation out of proportion. But the evidence had been overwhelming. The financial crimes had painted a picture of a woman who had been systematically abusing her position for years. The disability rights violations had shown a pattern of discrimination and harassment. The animal cruelty charges had been supported by clear video evidence and expert testimony. The jury had deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all counts. Patricia had been found guilty of animal cruelty, violating the civil rights of a disabled person, embezzlement, fraud, and reckless endangerment. The judge had immediately ordered her assets frozen pending restitution proceedings. The sentencing had been swift and severe. Patricia had been sentenced to 5 years in federal prison, with an additional 3 years of supervised probation. She had been ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA for the stolen funds, as well as damages to the Torres family for medical expenses and emotional trauma. The civil lawsuit had been settled for an undisclosed amount, with sources close to the case suggesting that the figure was in the high 6 figures. The settlement had included provisions for ongoing medical care for Buddy and therapy for Sarah, as well as funding for disability rights advocacy. The impact of the case had extended far beyond Maple Grove. The Torres v. Holloway decision had become a landmark precedent in disability rights law, establishing strong protections for service dog handlers in private communities. The case had also sparked nationwide reforms in HOA governance and oversight. Congress had passed the Service Dog Protection Act, creating federal criminal penalties for anyone who deliberately injured or interfered with a service animal. The legislation had been dubbed Buddy's Law by supporters, and Sarah had been invited to the White House for the signing ceremony. The Maple Grove community had undergone a transformation. The HOA had reformed its governance structure, implementing transparency measures and resident oversight committees. The association had also established a fund for families with service animals, providing resources and support for disability accommodations. Mrs. Chen had been elected as the new HOA president, running on a platform of community healing and inclusive governance. One of her first acts had been to establish a memorial garden for Buddy, though the golden retriever was very much alive and continuing his work as Sarah's service dog. The garden had become a gathering place for the community, with residents often seen there with their own dogs, both service animals and pets. The space had been designed to be fully accessible, with wide paths and sensory gardens that provided therapeutic benefits for visitors with various disabilities. Sarah had returned to school with renewed confidence, her anxiety still present but manageable with Buddy's help and ongoing therapy. She had become something of a celebrity among her classmates, known as the girl who had stood up to injustice and won. But more importantly, she had learned that she had the strength to face her fears when she had the right support. The legal victory had also launched Michael's career in a new direction. He had founded the National Service Dog Legal Defense Fund, providing pro bono legal services to families whose service animals had been discriminated against or harmed. The organization had already taken on dozens of cases, using the Torres v. Holloway precedent to fight for disability rights across the country. Buddy had returned to full working capacity, his confidence restored through months of patient rehabilitation. The Golden Retriever had become something of a poster dog for service animal rights, appearing at conferences and advocacy events alongside Sarah. His story had inspired new training protocols for service dogs, helping them build resilience against traumatic incidents. The financial recovery had been substantial. Patricia's assets had been seized and liquidated, with the proceeds used to compensate the HOA for the stolen funds and the Torres family for their ordeal. Her suburban home had been sold, her luxury cars repossessed, and her bank accounts emptied to pay restitution. The house on Maple Grove Lane that had once belonged to Patricia now housed a family with twin boys who had autism spectrum disorder. The new residents had 2 service dogs, both trained to help with sensory regulation and safety. The community had welcomed them with open arms, a stark contrast to the hostility that had greeted the Torres family. The annual Buddy Day celebration had become a tradition in Maple Grove, with families from across the region coming to celebrate service dogs and disability rights. The event featured educational booths, demonstrations of service dog skills, and fundraising for families who needed assistance obtaining service animals. Sarah had grown into a confident advocate for disability rights, speaking at schools and community events about the importance of service dogs and the need for understanding and acceptance. Her story had been featured in children's books and documentary films, inspiring other young people to stand up for their rights. The case had also sparked reforms in HOA governance nationwide. Many states had passed legislation limiting the power of homeowners associations to discriminate against residents with disabilities, and training programs had been established to educate HOA board members about federal disability laws. 3 years after the incident, Sarah and Buddy had returned to the spot where it all began. The community fountain still bubbled peacefully, but now it was surrounded by the memorial garden and accessible pathways. A small plaque told the story of their struggle and victory, serving as a reminder of the importance of standing up for what's right. As Sarah sat on a bench with Buddy at her side, watching other families enjoy the peaceful space, she reflected on how much had changed. The anxiety was still there. Probably always would be. But she had learned that she was stronger than she had ever imagined. And she had learned that sometimes fighting for what's right meant that everyone benefited in the end. The Golden Retriever pressed his warm body against her legs, a familiar comfort that had seen her through the darkest days. Sarah scratched behind his ears, feeling the soft fur that had once been matted with blood and dirt. Buddy's tail wagged gently, and in his dark eyes, she could see the same unconditional love and loyalty that had never wavered, even in the face of cruelty and injustice. The sun was setting over Maple Grove Lane, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Children played in the accessible playground that had been built with part of the settlement money, their laughter echoing across the community. Parents watched from benches, some with service dogs of their own, others simply enjoying the peaceful evening. In the distance, Mrs. Chen tended to her prized roses, which had thrived in the years since the incident. The elderly woman had become a beloved community leader, her gentle wisdom helping to heal the divisions that had once threatened to tear the neighborhood apart. As Sarah and Buddy walked home, they passed the spot where Patricia's BMW had once sat. Now it was a small garden, dedicated to healing and remembrance, with flowers that bloomed in cycles throughout the year. The space served as a reminder that even in the aftermath of cruelty, beauty and hope could flourish. The house that Sarah shared with her father had become a beacon of hope for other families facing similar struggles. Michael continued his work with the National Service Dog Legal Defense Fund, taking on cases that might have seemed impossible just a few years earlier. His success in the Torres v. Holloway case had given him both the resources and the credibility to fight for others who faced discrimination and injustice. As they reached their front door, Sarah paused to look back at the community that had been forever changed by their struggle. The streetlights were beginning to flicker on, casting a warm glow over the quiet neighborhood. In the distance, she could see other families returning home, their service dogs walking calmly at their sides, no longer afraid of harassment or discrimination. The victory had been hard-won, but it had been worth every moment of pain and struggle. Sarah had learned that standing up for what's right wasn't always easy, but it was always necessary. And she had learned that sometimes the smallest voices could create the biggest changes. Inside the house, Sarah's father was preparing dinner, the kitchen filled with the warm smells of home cooking. Buddy took his usual place by the stove, knowing that the occasional treat might fall his way. The golden retriever had returned to his old habits, but he was wiser now, more aware of the world's complexities. The family had grown closer through their ordeal, bound together by shared trauma and triumph. Michael had learned to appreciate the simple moments, the quiet evenings when his daughter was calm and his dog was healthy. Sarah had learned that she was braver than she had ever imagined, and that sometimes the greatest victories came from the most difficult battles. As they sat down to dinner, Sarah reached under the table to pat Buddy's head. The golden retriever looked up at her with eyes full of trust and love, the same eyes that had watched over her through panic attacks and public testimony, through medical treatments and legal proceedings. The case of Torres v. Holloway had ended, but its legacy continued. Across the country, families with service dogs walked a little taller, knowing that they had legal protections and community support. HOA boards thought twice before discriminating against residents with disabilities, aware that their actions could have serious consequences. And in Maple Grove Lane, a small girl and her golden retriever had shown that sometimes the greatest victories come from the most unlikely heroes. Their story had become a testament to the power of courage, the importance of standing up for what's right, and the unbreakable bond between a child and her service dog. The evening had settled into comfortable quiet, with Sarah working on homework at the kitchen table and Buddy sleeping peacefully at her feet. The golden retriever's breathing was steady and calm, his body relaxed in the way that only came with complete trust and security. Michael looked at his daughter and her companion, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for all they had endured and overcome. The legal victory had been satisfying, but seeing his daughter's confidence restored and her anxiety manageable was the real prize. The case had changed laws and policies, but more importantly, it had changed lives. As the night deepened, Sarah prepared for bed with Buddy following his usual routine. The golden retriever would sleep on a special bed next to Sarah's, always alert for signs of distress, always ready to provide comfort and support. It was a routine that had been interrupted by trauma, but had ultimately been strengthened by their shared experience. The last news report about the case had aired earlier that week, marking the 3rd anniversary of the incident. The reporter had interviewed Sarah and Buddy, now both older and wiser, about how their lives had changed. Sarah had spoken eloquently about the importance of service dogs and the need for understanding and acceptance in communities. The interview had ended with Sarah and Buddy playing in the memorial garden, the golden retriever's tail wagging as he chased a ball thrown by his young handler. It was a simple moment, but it captured the essence of their victory, the right to live normal lives, free from discrimination and fear. As Sarah drifted off to sleep, Buddy settled into his watch position, his ears pricked for any sign of distress. The golden retriever's dedication had never wavered, even through the darkest days of their ordeal. He had learned that protecting Sarah meant more than just providing comfort during anxiety attacks. It meant standing strong in the face of injustice. The house on Maple Grove Lane was quiet now, but it was a peaceful quiet, filled with the security that comes from knowing you have fought for what's right and won. The legal documents were filed away, the settlements were paid, and the reforms were implemented. But the real victory was in the simple fact that a little girl and her service dog could sleep peacefully, knowing that their community supported them and their rights were protected. The story of Torres v. Holloway had become more than just a legal case. It had become a symbol of hope for families facing discrimination and injustice. The precedent it set would protect countless other families, ensuring that no child would have to watch their service dog be harmed simply for existing. And in the quiet of the night, as Buddy maintained his vigil and Sarah slept peacefully, the golden retriever's presence served as a reminder that sometimes the greatest strength comes from the gentlest hearts, and that the bond between a child and her service dog is powerful enough to change the world.